What's up guys, it's Brad from Light Architect here. In this video I'm going to be showing how you can add some interactive CG rain to your live action shots inside of Blender. To do this we'll be adding a rain particle system as well as a interactive ground plane that has a wet map attached to it that is driven by that rain particle system. Before we get started, I'd like to announce that we have just released our Weather Effects add-on for Blender. Weather Effects is a fairly simple add-on that allows you to add rain, snow, or hail particle systems to your scene with those 3D assets attached to them and get those weather effects added to your scene fairly quickly. We've released weather effects on Blender Market, so if you're interested, feel free to check it out there and start adding some cinematic weather to your scenes. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. As usual, the first thing we're going to do is just delete everything in our scene here. And now we're going to import our live action shot that we're going to add our CG rain to. So I'll just go to the plus tab here and go to visual effects and then motion tracking. And now I'll open our clip here. So you can obviously use any footage of your choice, but I'm going to use this footage of this woman hitchhiking. So I'll go ahead and open this clip here. And this is the shot we're going to be adding our CG rain to. So now we'll click on set scene frames so that Blender automatically sets the timeline for the length of our clip. And then I'll also click on prefetch so that Blender loads all of the frames into our timeline so there's not any buffering. Alright, so this is a fairly simple shot. As you can see here, if I play through it, it's just a very basic handheld shot, but not too much parallax. So what we can do is we can use a very simple tripod track to track it. So I'll just go to our tracking settings here. I generally set this to blurry footage just to have a little bit more detail to track. And I'm just going to literally select one point here for our tracking marker. So I think maybe there's a point right here. I might choose that for now. And then I'll also choose this point right here. I'll click on normalize and select both of these points and then track backward and then track them forward as well. And these 2 points should be enough because they're going to calculate the rotation of our camera as well as the panning and tilting. But since our camera doesn't move through that 3D space very much, we don't actually need to 3D track this shot. So this should be pretty good. Now I'll go to our solve tab. I'll select the tripod option as I mentioned. And in this case, I'm just going to refine our focal length of this shot. And now I'll go to our top right here. I'll press Shift A. I'll add a camera back into our scene and click on solve camera motion. And now as you can see here, we have a solve error of 0.07 pixels, which is barely anything. I sometimes use 3D tracks with a error of up to 2 pixels, depending on the shot obviously, but this should definitely be good enough. All right, so now that we have solved our tripod track here, let's scroll down here to our scene setup tab here and click on set as background. And now as you can see here, our footage will show up in the background of our camera. And then I'm going to set the origin of our shot with one of these points just to speed up our process a bit. So just click that, and now as you can see here, the point of 000 in our 3D scene is this point right here. And of course we'll adjust our camera later, but this is just a nice way to get started fairly quickly. Alright, so this is pretty nice. Now I'm just going to click on setup tracking scene, and Blender is going to import a very basic cube here in our foreground and then a background shadow catcher as well. And it's also going to create some view layers for us to composite with. And we're not going to be using these exactly as Blender imported them into our scene, but this is just a nice way for Blender to set up a lot of the things that we might have to create eventually anyway. So also in the compositing tab, when you click on setup tracking scene, some of the nodes are automatically set up for you, which I tend to find pretty helpful. But anyways, now that we're done motion tracking our shot and setting up our tracking scene, I'll go back to layout mode here and let's create our rain for our shot. All right, so before we do this, I do want to adjust our camera a bit. So one thing I want to do is while our camera is selected, I want to click on the drop down menu here and click on motion tracking. And you can see that our 2 tracking points have come into our scene here. And this is just nice reference to line up our camera to the geometry of our ground here. So I'll just view through our camera here really quick and start dragging our camera down and just kind of position our camera according to the 3D geometry of our world here. I'll go ahead and delete our cube since it's kind of in the way. And I just want to align our 2 tracking points to this ground plane. So I'll just try to align them by eye here for the most part. Something like that is pretty good. And now that our points are aligned here, I might just scale down our ground plane here and maybe rotate our camera a little bit so that our ground plane is similar to the perspective of the road here. Alright, so this should be pretty good. Try to align the perspective of your shot as close as you can. We don't actually need this ground shadow catcher, but it's just a nice reference to line up our camera to the scene. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start creating our rain particle system. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A, and we're going to go to Mesh and add a plane. and I'm going to put this above our character here, or where our character would be in our scene, and this is going to be the plane in which we emit those rain particles from. So this should be pretty good. I'll kind of scale it up a little bit, and we'll go to our particle tab here and click on the plus button, and now as you can see here, a particle system has been added to our scene. And you know, this could work for rain fairly well, but we're going to adjust some of these settings to make it a little bit nicer. One thing I'll do is under velocity, I'll decrease the normal velocity to 0, or maybe even -1, so that the particles have a velocity coming downward a little bit. So that should be pretty good. Another thing I might do is increase the number of rain particles to maybe try like 6,000, just so we have quite a bit of rain in our scene. That should be pretty nice, and we can also view this through our camera like so. And obviously these are too big right now, but we'll go ahead and fix that once we add our rain droplet. So this should be pretty good for now. Now let's create our rain droplet and instance it where these particles are. So I'll press Shift A, I'll add a very basic icosphere, and just for the sake of speed, I'm going to decrease our subdivisions of this icosphere to 1, so it's just a very small icosphere here. And of course, depending on the detail you want in your individual rain droplet, you may want to increase this, but this should be pretty good for now, since our rain isn't, you know, a super close render right by the camera. So this should be good. Now I'm going to go to Object, I'm going to shade this icosphere as smooth, and then I'm going to select it, and I'll call it rain droplet. And as you can see here, if I go to rendered view, you'll notice that we need to actually add a material to our rain droplet here. So for rain, I usually use a mixture between glass and a glossy shader. So in this specific case, I'm just going to use a glass shader, but feel free to play around with different techniques. I'll go here to our material properties, I'll click on new, and rather than use the principled BSDF, I will change this to glass. And actually nothing is happening right now because our background is not transparent and is the same color as the rest of our environment, so it's just all reflecting through the glass here and it all looks the same. So what I'm going to do is add a basic HDRI and then turn our environment to transparent. So I'll go here to our world properties tab here under color, I'll add an environment texture, and then I'll click on open, and then I'll just load an HDRI that's similar to our live action shot here. And obviously it's ideal if you have an HDRI of your exact environment, but this should work pretty good if we just dial down the intensity a bit and make it a bit darker. It'll give us some nice reflections. And while we're here, I'll also make our background transparent. So I'll go to our render properties tab here. I'll also switch over to the Cycles rendering engine, and then under film, I'll turn on the transparent option here so we can you know, see our glass with a transparent background. And then I'll also turn on the transparent glass option so that we can composite this over our live action shot, and it will preserve some of that transparency. And you don't actually always have to do this, but in this specific case, I found that that can give a little bit nicer result. All right, so we have created our rain droplet. Now it's time to instance it on our particle system here. So I'll select our particle system, I'll go to our particle tab, scroll down here to render, and then rather than rendering it as a halo, I'm going to render this as an object, and then I'm going to instance the rain droplet that we have created here. And now as you can see here, if I play through our scene, we're getting all of our rain droplets dropping into our scene, and this is going to give us a nicer result. Obviously our droplets are a little bit too big, so one thing we could do is select our rain droplet here and scale it down a bit, and then we could also select our particle system and control the size through our render tab here. So I might just increase the scale randomness a bit to provide our rain with a little bit of randomness, so maybe 0.75, and then you know, we can adjust these later if we need to dial it in a bit better. Now we have kind of a nice rain particle system. I think they're still a little bit too big, so under the scale setting here, I'll bring it down to maybe 0.3, and that's looking a bit nicer. And as you can see, if I go to rendered view, you'll see that we have these nice rain droplets coming into our scene here. All right, so now that we have created our general rain particle system, we can adjust this a bit in the future, but I'm pretty happy with this for our initial particle system. Now let's create our ground plane for the dynamic wet map driven by these rain particles as they hit the ground. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A. I'll add a plane to our scene, and I just want to position it in the same area as our ground plane shadow catcher. You could use the ground plane here already, but this is enabled as a shadow catcher, so I figured it's probably easier to just add a new plane to our scene. Just kind of rotate this and place this where the ground would be, or where the road would be for that matter. Just kind of position it like so. All right, so this looks about right. Now I'll select our ground plane here. I'll go ahead and delete this, and I'll also delete our background collection here. as well as the light in our scene, since we're using an HDRI to light it. And I'll just kind of reposition our ground plane here. This is what we're going to use as our wet map. So just make sure it aligns up with your street here. All right, so now I'll just rename this. I'll call it wet map. And I'll also name our particle system here. I'll call it rain particle system. And I want to move our rain particle system to a new collection. So I'll press M, I'll move it to a new collection, and I'll call it rain particle system. Okay. So now we have it in its own collection, and we can use this collection to drive our wet map. And I'll also go ahead and select our foreground collection and delete this. So now we just have a much more simple setup that we'll organize a bit later. All right, so now let's select our wet map ground plane here. And we're going to use dynamic paint to add our interactive droplets here. So I'll go to our physics properties tab here. I'll select dynamic paint, and we want to use the type canvas and then add a canvas to our scene. And we'll leave these at their default vertex, paint. And for our brush collection, we want to select the rain particle system collection that we have just created that contains our rain particle system. So I'll select that, and you know, we can play around with a few of these settings later. But for output, we want to make sure that the wet map layer is being output so that we can use it to create the material for our wet map. So I'll go ahead and press the plus button, and now a wet map has been added to our ground plane wet map here. One more thing we need to do is we need to make our particle system a dynamic paint brush. So I'll select our rain particle system here. I'll go to dynamic paint and add it as a brush. Click on add brush, and then under paint I'll choose particle system and select our particle system that's attached to our plane here. And there are a few more things we have to do before we can see a result here. We want to select our wet map ground plane once more. I want to go to edit mode, and we want to subdivide our plane here a bit so that we actually have the detail in our mesh to create that dynamic paint wet map effect for those droplets. So I'll click on edge, subdivide, then I'll subdivide it by 10. And then I want to do it one more time to give a little bit more detail. Subdivide it once more, do another 10, just so we have a little more detail. And now we'll have that detail for the wet map to be created. All right, so right now, as you can see, if we go to rendered view, nothing is really going to be seen on our ground plane here. And that's because we have to set up our material so that we can actually use the dynamic paint effect within it. So what I'll do is I'll go to our wet map canvas settings under the wet map layer. I'll select this and I'll press Command C on Mac to copy it. And then I'll go to our material tab, add a new material. We'll call it wet map. And now I'll go to our shading tab, and this is where the magic can happen. So I'll go to render view really quick, and what I want to do is I want to use our wet map attribute to drive our roughness input in our principled BSDF shader. So I'll press Shift A, I'll add an input attribute, move the color to our roughness, and then for our name of the attribute, I'll press Command V to paste our wet map information. And if we zoom in here, you'll notice that we actually have some droplets where our rain has been hitting our ground here. But obviously this isn't perfect yet. We need to adjust a few more things. One thing I want to do is actually use our wet map data to make certain parts of this ground plane transparent as well, so that we can overlay it on top of our live action shot. So to do that, I will press Shift A, we'll add a mix shader. We'll add it right before our material output, and I will use our color output from our wet map attribute and put it in our factor. And you can see the droplets a little bit more effectively here. And what we want to do is we want to add a transparent node on the bottom shader here. So I'll press Shift A, add a transparent BSDF shader, connect this to our mix shader, and now we have transparency where the drops are, but not where the surface would be dry. So what we can do is we can press Shift A, I'll add a color invert and add this right on the factor of our mix shader. Whoops, wrong spot there. We want to do it on the factor. There we go. All right, so now as you can see here, we have our wet map only where the droplets are. And what we can do is we can bring down the color of this BSDF shader. And you can see that if we get the right angle here, we're catching some nice reflections from our HDRI. So this is what we're going to use to overlay on top of our footage to create that dynamic wet street. And so I'll just go back to layout mode here, and we'll go to render view just to see what we're getting so far. And our droplets are filling up our street a little bit too much in my opinion. So what we can do to deal with that, I think we can just select our wet map here. I'll go to physics properties. We can select the dissolve option so that the wet map dissolves over time. And then also we can decrease the radius here. So maybe I'll put this to 0.25 since our droplets on our wet map are pretty big. And then I'll play through it again. And let's see what that does for us. There we go, much better. So now, as you can see here, our droplets are being painted much smaller on our street here, which is going to be much nicer. There are a lot of settings you can play with in your dynamic paint options. You can play with the dry time frame of your wet map, add different effects to it, have our wet map drip, for example. But in my opinion, this effect works pretty well at its default, other than just changing the radius depending on how big you want your rain particles to be. Alright, so now that we have added our rain effects to our 3D scene, let's bake our particle systems as well as our dynamic painted wet map, and then organize our scene into view layers so that we can composite them together effectively. The first thing I'll do is I'll go to our particle tab here. While our rain particle system is selected, I want to decrease the scale of our rain a little bit, maybe to 0.28. Play around with the size of it a bit if you like. I want to go to the cache tab, and then I just want to bake the particle system. So make sure you have, the right amount of rain particles. I might increase the number of these rain particles to maybe 8,000. And bake our particle system. And now we don't have to start from the beginning, and our particle system is baked into our scene. All right, so now that we have baked our rain particle system, I'll select our wet map, go back to physics properties, and under its cache, we have to bake the wet map as well. But as you can see here, cache is disabled until the file is saved. So I'll go ahead and save our file here. I'll call it rain tutorial for YouTube. And now we can bake our dynamic paint effect. Alright, so we have our baked wet map and we have our baked rain particle system. Now let's set up our view layers to render them separately so that we can have a lot more control in the compositing process. So I'll go to our top right here. I'll rename this layer rain particles. And for this layer, we're only going to be rendering our rain particle system here. And we'll select our wet map and move it to a new collection. We'll call it wet map. Click OK. And we'll go here to our filter options and enable all of our restriction toggles so we can adjust a few things here. And for our wet map collection, I'll enable this as a holdout so that any rain particles that pass beyond our ground plane here will be masked out automatically. And now, as you can see here, if I go to rendered view, you'll notice that only our rain is being rendered on this view layer, but not our wet map, which is exactly what we want. Now we want to create a view layer for our wet map. So I'll add a new view layer here and we'll call this wet map. And for our rain particle system collection, I will select the indirect only option so that the rain particles only affect this view layer indirectly and won't actually be rendered in our scene. And then for our wet map collection, we'll leave as is. And now, as you can see here, if I go to rendered view, only the wet map is being rendered on this view layer. All right, so perfect. Now, one more thing, I want to delete our background collection that Blender has created for us automatically. So I'll select it and press X. And now we have two different view layers that we can work with in our compositor. Now we are pretty much there. One more thing before I render out a test render and go through the compositing process. One thing that can sometimes make or break your composite is recreating your CG environment similarly to the live action shot. For this specific tutorial, I've only added a basic HDRI in our world properties, which I think is going to work just fine. But if you want to be more precise with it, I recommend you take a projection of your scene here and project it on geometry around your scene so that, for example, you'll get very realistic reflections on your wet map here, as well as realistic lighting on your rain particle system. And I have a tutorial on how you can reproject your environments very simply. I'll put a link to that in the description below, but most of the time you can get a fairly good result since there's lots of motion blur, and with a little bit of compositing, you can blend it into your scene fairly well. But anyways, now let's get into compositing. Before we do a test render and start that process, I do want to go to the render properties tab here, and I do recommend enabling the motion blur option. Depending on how much blur you want in your rain particles, you may want to decrease the shutter for less motion blur or even increase it to 1 if you want a lot more motion blur, but I'm going to maybe put it at 0.35 just so there's a little bit of motion blur, but not so much that each particle is totally a blur. But we may adjust this later in the tutorial as well. But anyways, guys, this should be pretty good. So I'll just go to render and render image, and let's see what we get. Alright guys, so we are back and this is our initial result here, and as you can see we have some nice motion blur on our rain particles. However, we're not seeing our wet map on the street here, and the reason for that is because in our compositing node setup we haven't actually overlaid it on top of our shot. So I'll go ahead and close this window here and go to our compositing tab and make those fixes. So what we have here right now is our main live action shot here going in through an undistortion and scale node, which Blender sets up automatically based on your camera track, and then we have our rain particles being overlaid on top of our live action shot here. And then we have another render layer of our rain particles view layer being overlaid once more. And this is all going into our composite and viewer node. And the reason we have two different rain particles view layers being overlaid is because by default, whenever we press that setup render scene, it set up two render layers for us, one to be the shadow catcher and one to be the foreground layer. But we don't actually need them both right now, so I'll go ahead and delete one of them, and then we'll keep the second one but delete this alpha over node. So now we just have one view layer right now. And the first view layer that we actually want to overlay is not our rain particles, but actually our wet map. So I'll go ahead and select our wet map view layer here. And now, as you can see here, our wet map is being overlaid on top of our ground here. And as you can see here, the wet map is not interacting with our character here. So one thing we might do to resolve this is go to a new visual effects tab and create a masking option here. I'll open up our footage. I'll create a new mask. We'll call it character. And I'll press Control click, and I'll just create a very rudimentary mask around our character's feet here. And as usual, you can be as precise or rudimentary as you like, but this is just the general concept. We'll just go around her feet here, close the mask at the top, something like this. And what we could do, since our shot does move a little bit, is we'll select all of our masking points here, and then press Shift, select one of our tracking markers, and then press Control P. And now this mask will move in accordance to how this tracking point moves. And depending on the complexity of your shot, you may have to do some rotoscoping here, but this should work pretty good for this example. All right, so now that we have masked out our character's legs here, I'll go back to the Compositing tab and utilize this masking data to overlay our character back onto our background so it doesn't intersect with our wet map here. So I'll press Shift A, I'll add a input mask, then I will select our character mask here, and then I want to press Shift A again, and then go to Converter, set alpha, and put that in between our alpha over node and wet map view layer. And then we'll use the mask here into the alpha channel. And now, as you can see here, we're getting our wet map data only where our character's feet are. So what we can do is we'll press Shift A. Under color, I'll add an invert node, add this right before our set alpha node. And now, as you can see here, we have the appropriate effect where our character's legs are being masked out from our wet map. All right, so our wet map is looking pretty good. Let's adjust a few of the settings to blend it into our scene a bit better. The easiest thing to do is just dial it back a little bit, since I think it's a little bit too prevalent in our scene. So I might just dial back the alpha over node so it just doesn't overlay quite as much onto our scene. And now it's already looking quite a bit more realistic because some of the real environment is bleeding through that wet map. And another thing I might do is just add a very basic RGB curves node and maybe just bring down the general brightness of our wet map so it's a little bit darker, like it would be if the scene were a bit wet maybe. Something like that should be pretty good. Just enough to add a wet portion of the street there, but not so much that it's too prevalent in our scene. All right, so I'm pretty happy with this wet map here. Now let's overlay our rain particle system. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A. We'll add an input render layers, and we want to add this rain after our wet map in the node setup. I'll select our alpha over node here. I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and then I'll connect it to our composite node as well as our viewer. And for the render layers node that we've added, I want to make sure that rain particles is selected, and then I'll just take our image output from our rain particles view layer and connect it to this alpha over node, which now, as you can see, is creating that rain effect on top of our live action shot. Now, we did adjust the alpha over node factor here on our wet map view layer, but we actually want to increase this back to 1, and now the raindrops are showing up a bit better in our scene. And I'll also go ahead and add a RGB curves node here, maybe increase the brightness of our rain particle system so that it's just a little bit more obvious in our scene. But this is looking really nice in my opinion. Of course, depending on the look you're going for, depending on how much you want it to downpour, you can, increase the amount of particles in your rain particle system and rebake both your particle system and wet map fairly easily. But this is the general concept here. Of course, to output your final project through your composite here, you would just go to your output settings, choose where to save your file in your file output here. I generally use an OpenEXR sequence for visual effects, and then add that to a different timeline, usually 1920 by 1080p resolution at 100%. Then under our render properties tab, depending on the amount of detail you want, you may want to increase the samples. I found that for these kind of blurry particle effects, I can get away with 40 to 50 samples and still look pretty good. You can also add some denoising if you like, but under advanced, I do recommend generally selecting the seed stopwatch for some noise variation, and you should be pretty good from there. So to output your frames in your timeline to your selected output here, you would just go to render and render animation, and Blender will go through all of your frames and export it as an image sequence. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what kind of visual effects tutorials you'd like to see next. If you're interested in adding more weather effects to your scenes, check out our weather effects add-on on Blender Market. I hope you find it useful. I'll see you next time.